Throughout American history, the tradition of granting condemned prisoners a final meal before execution has revealed the deeply human side of our justice system. From simple comfort foods to elaborate feasts, these last requests offer a window into the minds of those facing their final moments. Some requests have been so outrageous, so excessive, that they've changed prison policies forever. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you never miss a video. And let's get into it. Lawrence Russell Brewer, Texas. On June 7, 1998, 31-year-old Lawrence Russell Brewer committed one of the most heinous hate crimes in modern American history. Along with two accomplices, Brewer abducted 49-year-old James Byrd Jr. from a convenience store in Jasper, Texas. What followed would shock the nation and forever change how we view racially motivated violence. The three men drove Byrd to a remote rural road in Jasper County. There, they beat him unconscious before chaining him by his ankles to the back of their pickup truck. Brewer and his accomplices then dragged Byrd for approximately 3 miles along the asphalt road. The victim was conscious for at least 2 miles of this ordeal before his body was torn apart. When authorities found the remains, they discovered Byrd had been decapitated when his body hit a concrete culvert. His head and right arm were found about a mile from his torso. The crime was purely racially motivated. Brewer, a white supremacist with extensive prison tattoos and ties to the Confederate Knights of America, had specifically targeted Byrd because he was black. The brutality of the attack sent shockwaves across Texas and the entire country, becoming a symbol of the persistent evil of racial hatred in America. Brewer's trial began in 1999 in Brazos County, after the venue was moved from Jasper due to extensive pretrial publicity. Prosecutor Guy James Gray presented overwhelming evidence of Brewer's racist ideology and his central role in planning the attack. The defense, led by attorney Doug Barlow, attempted to distance Brewer from the most violent aspects of the crime and challenged the prosecution's evidence regarding his racist motivations. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding Brewer guilty of capital murder on September 20, 1999. 3 days later, on September 23, the same jury sentenced him to death. The evidence had been overwhelming, including DNA evidence, witness testimony, and Brewer's own admissions about his white supremacist beliefs. Brewer's appeals process lasted over a decade. His conviction and sentence were affirmed by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals denied his federal habeas corpus petition on December 29, 2006. No relief was granted through the clemency process, and Judge Jerome Owens set Brewer's execution date for September 21, 2011. During his 12 years on death row at the Polunsky Unit, Brewer remained largely unrepentant for his crime. The case had already made national headlines during the trial, and it continued to draw attention as one of the most notorious hate crimes in recent memory. The murder had spurred Texas legislators to pass the James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Act in 2001, strengthening penalties for crimes motivated by bias. On the day of his execution, Brewer was transferred from death row to the Huntsville Unit, known as the Walls Unit, where Texas conducts all its executions. It was there that he made a last meal request that would go down in prison history as one of the most excessive ever recorded. Brewer ordered 2 chicken fried steaks with gravy and sliced onions, a triple meat bacon cheeseburger with fixings on the side, a cheese omelet with ground beef, tomatoes, onions, bell peppers, and jalapenos, a large bowl of fried okra with ketchup, 1 pound of barbecue with half a loaf of white bread, 3 fajitas with all the fixings, a meat lover's pizza, a pint of Bluebell vanilla ice cream, a slab of peanut butter fudge with crushed peanuts, and 3 root beers. The meal was estimated to contain over 10,000 calories and cost the state of Texas approximately $20 to prepare. However, when the massive feast was delivered to Brewer's cell that afternoon, he refused to eat any of it, not a single bite. Prison officials reported that the condemned man simply looked at the elaborate spread and turned away, saying he wasn't hungry. At 6:11 p.m. on September 21, 2011, Lawrence Russell Brewer was executed by lethal injection using pentobarbital. Members of James Byrd Jr.'s family witnessed the execution from the viewing room. When given the opportunity to make a final statement, Brewer declined to speak. He was pronounced dead at 6:21 p.m. Brewer's refusal to eat his elaborate last meal had immediate and lasting consequences. The very next day, September 22, 2011, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice announced it was ending the century-old tradition of special last meal requests for condemned inmates. Senator John Whitmire, who had pushed for the policy change, stated that Brewer had made a mockery of the system. From that day forward, Texas death row inmates would receive the same meal as the general prison population on their execution day. Lawrence Russell Brewer was 44 years old when he was executed. Victor Faguer, Iowa. On March 15, 1963, 28-year-old Victor Harry Faguer became the last person executed by the federal government until the resumption of federal executions in 2001. His case stands out not for the complexity of his final meal request, but for its haunting simplicity and symbolic meaning. Faguer had been convicted of kidnapping and murdering Dr. Edward Bartels in Dubuque, Iowa in 1960. The crime began when Faguer, posing as someone in need of medical attention, called the doctor to a fake address. When Dr. Bartels arrived, Faguer kidnapped him and drove him across state lines into Illinois, where he shot him in the head and dumped his body in a cornfield. The interstate nature of the crime brought federal jurisdiction and made Faguer eligible for the federal death penalty. During his trial, Faguer claimed he was addicted to drugs and had committed the murder to obtain narcotics from the doctor's medical bag. However, investigators found no evidence that Dr. Bartels had been carrying any drugs at the time of his murder. The jury found Faguer guilty of kidnapping, resulting in death, and he was sentenced to death under federal law. Faguer spent nearly 3 years on federal death row at the Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison. As his execution date approached, prison officials asked him what he wanted for his last meal. His request was remarkably simple: a single olive with the pit still in it. Prison staff were puzzled by this unusual request. When they asked Faguer to explain his choice, he told them he hoped an olive tree would sprout from his grave as a symbol of peace. The request was granted, and on the morning of March 15, 1963, Faguer consumed his solitary olive. Faguer was executed by hanging at the Iowa State Penitentiary, the last person to be executed by the federal government for nearly 4 decades. When given the opportunity for final words, he said, "I did not get a fair trial, and I am not guilty of this crime. May God bless all mankind." After his execution, the olive pit was indeed found in Faguer's suit pocket when his body was prepared for burial. Whether by design or coincidence, this small detail added to the haunting symbolism of his final meal choice. Victor Faguer was 28 years old when he was executed. Timothy McVeigh, Indiana. Nearly 4 decades after Faguer's execution, the federal government resumed carrying out death sentences with the execution of Timothy James McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. McVeigh's final meal request would become as infamous as the crime that put him on death row. On April 19, 1995, 26-year-old McVeigh detonated a truck bomb outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people, including 19 children. The attack was the deadliest domestic terrorist incident in United States history and was motivated by McVeigh's anti-government beliefs and his anger over the federal sieges at Ruby Ridge and Waco. McVeigh was arrested just 90 minutes after the bombing during a routine traffic stop for driving without a license plate. Initially held on weapons charges, He was later identified as the primary suspect in the bombing through forensic evidence and witness testimony. His trial began in 1997 in Denver, Colorado, after a change of venue from Oklahoma City. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence linking McVeigh to the bombing, including traces of explosive residue on his clothing, his rental of the truck used in the attack, and his purchase of the fertilizer used to make the bomb. McVeigh's defense team argued that he was being scapegoated for a larger conspiracy, but the jury found him guilty on all 11 counts, including 8 counts of murder for the deaths of federal law enforcement officers. On June 13, 1997, McVeigh was sentenced to death. His appeals were largely unsuccessful, and he eventually stopped fighting his death sentence, saying he preferred execution to life in prison. He was scheduled to be executed at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. For his final meal, McVeigh requested 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. Prison officials were surprised by the simplicity of the request, given the magnitude of his crimes and the extensive media coverage surrounding his execution. The ice cream was delivered to his cell on the morning of June 11, 2001. McVeigh spent his final hours reading and meeting with his attorneys. When asked if he had any final words, he handed prison officials a handwritten copy of the poem Invictus by William Ernest Henley, which ends with the lines, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." At 7:14 a.m. on June 11, 2001, Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection. He became the first person executed by the federal government since Victor Fager in 1963. McVeigh was 33 years old when he was executed. John Wayne Gacy, Illinois. On May 10, 1994, 52-year-old John Wayne Gacy was executed for one of the most horrific serial killing sprees in American history. Between 1968 and 1978, Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys, burying most of their bodies in the crawl space beneath his suburban Chicago home. Gacy had led a double life as a successful businessman and community volunteer, while secretly luring victims to his home with promises of work or simply through chance encounters. He would grape, torture, and strangle his victims before disposing of their bodies. The discovery of 26 bodies buried on his property shocked the nation and earned him the nickname Killer Clown due to his part-time work entertaining children at parties. His trial began in 1980 and lasted 6 weeks. Gacy's defense team argued that he was insane, presenting testimony about his troubled childhood and claiming he suffered from multiple personality disorder. However, the prosecution successfully argued that Gacy was legally sane and had carefully planned and concealed his crimes over many years. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Gacy guilty on all 33 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death and spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center, during which time he became one of America's most notorious inmates, even selling paintings he created in his cell. For his final meal, Gacy requested a dozen deep-fried shrimp, a bucket of original recipe chicken from Kentucky Fried Chicken, French fries, and a pound of fresh strawberries. The meal was delivered to his cell on the afternoon of May 9, 1994. Prison officials reported that Gacy ate most of the meal, though he left some of the strawberries untouched. Gacy's execution was carried out by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. The execution was delayed for several hours due to problems with the lethal injection equipment, causing the execution to be postponed from midnight to 12:58 a.m. on May 10th. When asked for his final words, Gacy reportedly said, "Kiss my ass. You'll never find the rest." This statement referred to investigators' belief that he had killed more victims than the 33 for which he was convicted, and that some bodies had never been recovered. John Wayne Gacy was 52 years old when he was executed. Ted Bundy, Florida. Perhaps no serial killer in American history captured public fascination quite like Theodore Robert Bundy. Charming, intelligent, and seemingly normal, Bundy confessed to 30 murders across 7 states between 1974 and 1978, though the actual number may have been much higher. Bundy typically targeted young women with long, dark hair parted in the middle, often approaching them in public places while feigning injury or disability to gain their trust. He would then abduct, assault, and murder his victims, sometimes returning to their remains to commit acts of necrophilia. His crimes spanned Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. Bundy was first arrested in Utah in 1975 for attempted kidnapping, but he escaped from custody twice while awaiting trial. During his second escape, he fled to Florida, where he committed his final known murders at the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in January 1978, killing 2 women and severely injuring 2 others. He was recaptured in February 1978 and put on trial in Florida for the Chi Omega murders. Despite representing himself for portions of the trial, Bundy was found guilty and sentenced to death. He would ultimately be convicted of 3 murders in Florida and sentenced to death 3 times. Bundy spent nearly 10 years on death row at Florida State Prison, during which time he became a media sensation. He granted numerous interviews to journalists, law enforcement officers, and psychologists, often discussing his crimes in detail while maintaining a facade of cooperation and charm. As his execution date of January 24, 1989 approached, Bundy was asked what he wanted for his last meal. He declined to make any special requests, so prison officials served him the standard death row final meal: medium rare steak, hash browns, toast with butter and jelly, milk, coffee, juice, and eggs over easy. Reports indicate that Bundy ate very little of the meal. On the morning of his execution, hundreds of people gathered outside Florida State Prison, many celebrating and holding signs reading "Burn, Bundy, Burn," and "Tuesday is Friday." The carnival-like atmosphere reflected the intense public interest in Bundy's case and the relief many felt that he would finally face justice. When asked for his final statement, Bundy said, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." He was referring to his attorneys James Coleman and Fred Lawrence. At 7:06 a.m. on January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. Ted Bundy was 42 years old when he was executed. Eileen Wuornos, Florida. On October 9, 2002, 46-year-old Aileen Carol Wuornos became one of the few women executed in the United States since the resumption of capital punishment in 1976. Her case garnered international attention not only because of her gender, but because of the unique circumstances surrounding her crimes and her deteriorating mental state on death row. Between 1989 and 1990, Wuornos killed 7 men in Florida while working as a prostitute. She claimed all the murders were committed in self-defense against men who had raped or attempted to assault her, but prosecutors argued that she had killed the men during robberies. Her first victim was Richard Mallory, found shot to death in December 1989 near Daytona Beach. Wuornos was arrested in January 1991 after her girlfriend, Tyria Moore, cooperated with police. During interrogation, Wuornos confessed to 6 of the 7 murders, maintaining that she had killed in self-defense. However, evidence suggested that she had robbed her victims after killing them. Her trial for the murder of Richard Mallory began in January 1992. Despite her claims of self-defense, the jury found her guilty of first-degree murder after deliberating for less than 2 hours. She was sentenced to death in January 1992 and would eventually be convicted of 5 additional murders. Wuornos spent over a decade on death row at the Broward Correctional Institution. During this time, her mental health appeared to deteriorate significantly. She made numerous bizarre claims, including allegations that prison staff were torturing her with sonic pressure and that she was being assaulted by prison guards. Mental health experts who examined her reported symptoms consistent with severe mental illness. In her final years, Wuornos repeatedly stated that she wanted to die and opposed efforts by some advocates to prevent her execution. She fired her attorneys and refused to pursue further appeals, saying she was tired of living and wanted her torment to end. For her final meal, Wuornos declined to make any special requests. She was served the standard prison meal: hamburger, mashed potatoes, and coffee. Prison officials reported that she ate very little of the food provided. On the morning of her execution, Wuornos appeared calm, but made several disturbing statements to the media and prison officials. In her final interview, she claimed that she would be returning as an angel and that society was corrupt and would face judgment. When asked for her final words, Wuornos said, "Yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie. Big mothership and all, I'll be back, I'll be back." At 9:47 a.m. on October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She became the 10th woman executed in the United States since the resumption of capital punishment and the second woman executed in Florida. Aileen Wuornos was 46 years old when she was executed. Gary Gilmore, Utah. The case of Gary Mark Gilmore holds a unique place in American death penalty history. Not only was he the first person executed in the United States after the Supreme Court effectively reinstated capital punishment in 1976, but he also became famous for actively fighting for his right to be executed rather than appealing his sentence. On July 19, 1976, 35-year-old Gilmore robbed and murdered Max Jensen, a gas station attendant in Orem, Utah. The following night, he robbed and killed Benny Bushnell, a motel manager in Provo. Both victims were young men with families, killed execution style with shots to the head during robberies that netted Gilmore minimal amounts of cash. Gilmore was arrested 2 days after the second murder, when a witness identified him and his white pickup truck. He confessed to both murders and was charged with first-degree murder. His trial began in October 1976, and despite his attorney's attempts to mount a defense, Gilmore was found guilty after the jury deliberated for just over an hour. Under Utah law, Gilmore was given the choice between execution by hanging or firing squad. He chose the firing squad. However, what made Gilmore's case unprecedented was his insistence that he wanted to die. When automatic appeals were filed on his behalf, Gilmore fought to have them dismissed, saying he preferred execution to life in prison. Gilmore's case sparked a national debate about the death penalty and prisoners' rights to choose execution over life imprisonment. His desire to be executed attracted significant media attention, and he received thousands of letters from around the world. Some supporters praised his acceptance of responsibility, while opponents argued that the state should not carry out executions regardless of the condemned person's wishes. During his time on death row at Utah State Prison, Gilmore became something of a celebrity. He granted numerous interviews and even received marriage proposals. His relationship with Nicole Baker, a woman he had been dating at the time of his crimes, continued through letters and visits. For his final meal, Gilmore requested hamburger, hard-boiled eggs, a baked potato, and coffee. He also asked for 3 shots of whiskey, but this request was denied by prison officials. The meal was served to him on the evening of January 16, 1977. On the morning of January 17, 1977, Gilmore was executed by firing squad at Utah State Prison. When asked if he had any final words, he simply said, "Let's do it." These words would later inspire Nike's famous advertising slogan, "Just do it." At 8:07 a.m., 5 volunteer marksmen fired their rifles at Gilmore, who was strapped to a chair with a black hood over his head and a white target pinned to his chest. 4 of the rifles contained live ammunition, while 1 contained a blank cartridge, so that none of the executioners would know with certainty whether they had fired a fatal shot. Gary Gilmore was 36 years old when he was executed. Ronnie Lee Gardner, Utah. On June 18, 2010, 49-year-old Ronnie Lee Gardner became one of the last people executed by firing squad in the United States. His case drew national attention not only because of the rare execution method, but also because of his unusual final meal request and the dramatic circumstances of his crimes. Gardner's path to death row began with a murder committed during an escape attempt from a Salt Lake City courthouse in 1985. While being escorted to a hearing on robbery charges, Gardner grabbed a gun from his attorney and shot dead attorney Michael Burdell. During the ensuing chaos, Gardner attempted to escape but was wounded by bailiffs. He was also convicted of murdering Melvin Otterstrom during a robbery earlier that year. Gardner's execution was notable because Utah was one of the few states that still offered the firing squad as an option for inmates sentenced before 1984. Gardner chose this method over lethal injection, making him only the third person executed by firing squad in the United States since the reinstatement of capital punishment. For his last meal, Gardner requested lobster tail, steak, apple pie, vanilla ice cream, and 7-Up. However, his most unusual request was for a last cigarette before his execution. Gardner was a lifelong smoker, and Utah prison officials granted this request despite the general prohibition on smoking in correctional facilities. At 12:20 a.m. on June 18, 2010, Gardner was executed by a 5-man firing squad at Utah State Prison. He was strapped to a chair with a black hood over his head, while 5 police officers fired .30 caliber Winchester rifles from a distance of about 25 feet. Gardner had no final words recorded. Ronnie Lee Gardner was 49 years old when he was executed. Teresa Lewis, Virginia. On September 23, 2010, 41-year-old Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis became the first woman executed in Virginia in nearly a century. Her case generated significant controversy due to questions about her mental capacity and her role as an accomplice rather than the actual killer in the murders. In October 2002, Lewis arranged for 2 men to kill her husband Julian Clifton Lewis and her stepson Charles Lewis in order to collect life insurance money. She had manipulated Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller, both significantly younger men with whom she had sexual relationships, into committing the murders in exchange for money and promises of continued relationships. Lewis left the door to her home unlocked and went to sleep while Schallenberger and Fuller entered and shot both victims as they slept. The plan unraveled when investigators discovered inconsistencies in Lewis's story and found evidence of her involvement in planning the crimes. During her trial, prosecutors portrayed Lewis as the mastermind who used sex and manipulation to convince others to commit murder for financial gain. The defense argued that Lewis had borderline intellectual functioning and was herself manipulated by Schallenberger, who was the actual planner of the crimes. However, the jury found her guilty and recommended the death sentence. Lewis's case attracted international attention and appeals for clemency from various groups, including the European Union. Supporters argued that executing Lewis would be unjust because she had not actually pulled the trigger and because of questions about her mental capacity. Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell ultimately declined to grant clemency. For her final meal, Lewis requested fried chicken breasts, peas with butter, apple pie, and Dr. Pepper. She reportedly ate most of the meal on the afternoon before her execution. Lewis spent her final hours meeting with her attorneys and spiritual advisors. When asked for final words, Lewis said, "I just want Kathy to know that I love her, and I'm very sorry for all this. I love my family. Tell them I'm very sorry." She was referring to Kathy Clifton, the daughter of one of her victims. At 9:13 p.m. on September 23, 2010, Teresa Lewis was executed by lethal injection at Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. Her execution sparked continued debate about the application of capital punishment to accomplices and individuals with diminished mental capacity. Teresa Lewis was 41 years old when she was executed. Robert Alton Harris, California. On April 21, 1992, 39-year-old Robert Alton Harris became the first person executed in California since 1967, ending a 25-year moratorium on capital punishment in the state. His execution was preceded by unprecedented legal drama that stretched through the night and into the early morning hours. Harris had been sentenced to death for the 1978 murders of two 16-year-old boys, John Mayeski and Michael Baker, whom he killed while stealing their car to use in a bank robbery. Harris and his brother Daniel had approached the teenagers at a fast food restaurant, forced them to drive to a remote area, and then shot them both. Harris reportedly laughed about the killings and even finished eating one of the victims' hamburgers at the scene. During his 14 years on death row at San Quentin State Prison, Harris exhausted numerous appeals. As his execution date approached, his attorneys filed last-minute appeals that resulted in 4 separate stays of execution being issued and lifted within a span of several hours on the night of April 20th and early morning of April 21st. The legal proceedings were so chaotic that Harris was actually strapped into the gas chamber twice during the night, only to be removed when temporary stays were granted. The final stay was lifted by the U.S. Supreme Court at 6:00 a.m., clearing the way for the execution to proceed. For his last meal, Harris requested Kentucky Fried Chicken, 2 large Domino's pizzas, ice cream, Pepsi, jelly beans, and a 6-pack of beer. Prison officials denied the beer request but provided the rest of the meal. Harris reportedly ate heartily, consuming most of the food provided. When asked for his final words, Harris looked toward the witnesses and said, "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everyone dances with the Grim Reaper." At 6:21 a.m. on April 21, 1992, Robert Alton Harris was executed in California's gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. Harris's execution marked the end of California's long hiatus from capital punishment and sparked renewed debate about the death penalty. The chaotic legal proceedings surrounding his execution would later influence reforms in the appeals process for death penalty cases. Robert Alton Harris was 39 years old when he was executed. The tradition of granting last meal requests to condemned prisoners represents one of the final acts of humanity in a system designed to carry out the ultimate punishment. From Lawrence Russell Brewer's excessive feast that ended Texas's century-old tradition to Victor Fager's symbolic single olive, these final requests reveal the complex psychology of individuals facing death. While some states have eliminated special meal privileges entirely, others continue to honor reasonable requests as a gesture of basic human dignity. The debate over last meals reflects broader questions about how society should treat those it has condemned to die, balancing justice with mercy in humanity's most final moments. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and share it. Subscribe for more in-depth coverage of death penalty cases and criminal justice issues. While some condemned inmates use their final meal as a last act of defiance or excess, others face their execution date with a different kind of resolve, one focused not on what they'll eat, but on when they'll die. The psychology of death row extends far beyond last requests to the complex emotions of those still waiting for their final day to arrive. The uncertainty, the appeals, the years of knowing your fate. It creates a unique mental landscape that shapes how inmates spend what could be their last months or years. Speaking of those still facing this reality, we previously covered a comprehensive look at the individuals currently scheduled for execution in 2026 prisoners whose final meals have yet to be requested, but whose time may soon come.
A list of names, a series of crimes, and a countdown to the final moment. These are the stories of the men scheduled for execution in the United States in 2026. Some call them monsters. Others argue their fate is unjust. But one thing is certain. Each of them has a past written in blood. Let's dive into their chilling cases and the moments that led them to death row. Some crimes shake a city to its core. Some leave wounds that never heal. This is one of them. It was June 25, 2000. Cleveland police officer Wayne Leon, a devoted husband and father, was on duty. Just another day, just another stop. Officer Leon had no idea he was about to walk into a nightmare. He was simply doing his job, pulling over a car with expired plates. Inside, Queasy Bryan, a man with a long and violent criminal history. Bryan had one goal that day, not to go back to prison, and he was willing to do whatever it took to stay free. As Officer Leon reached for his notepad, Bryan made his move. The shot was instant and merciless, a cold-blooded execution. Officer Leon never had a chance. Bryan fled the scene, triggering a massive manhunt. For 2 days, Cleveland was on edge, knowing a cop killer was on the loose. He was finally found hiding in a motel, trying to escape justice. But there was no way out. The jury wasted no time. Bryan was sentenced to death for the cold-blooded murder of Officer Wayne Leon. But Bryan wasn't done fighting. He launched appeal after appeal, trying to escape his fate. Yet the Ohio Supreme Court stood firm. The sentence was upheld. Bryan would pay for his crime. Now, after 26 years on death row, the state of Ohio has set an execution date, January 7, 2026. Some crimes shake a city to its core. Some leave wounds that never heal. This is one of them. It was July 3, 1997, a night that would leave Cleveland in shock. A night when 2 people would lose their lives at the hands of one man, Antonio Sanchez Franklin. Franklin, a career criminal, was no stranger to violence. That night, he pulled out a gun and opened fire. His first victim, 26-year-old Anthony Waters, shot execution style. But Franklin wasn't finished. Just minutes later, he gunned down another man, Curtis Maynard, a 25-year-old who never saw it coming. 2 lives stolen in a matter of minutes. And Franklin? He disappeared into the night, leaving a city in fear. With 2 murders in a single night, police were determined to track Franklin down. And it wouldn't take long before they got their break. Security cameras captured his movements. Within days, the manhunt led officers to an abandoned house where Franklin was hiding out. He thought he could escape justice, but he was wrong. Franklin showed no remorse as the charges were read. 2 counts of aggravated murder. The prosecution didn't hold back. Franklin was a cold-blooded killer who had no regard for human life. The jury wasted no time. The verdict? Guilty on all counts. And the sentence? Death. But Franklin wasn't done fighting. Like many convicted murderers, he launched appeal after appeal, trying to escape his fate. Yet, the Ohio Supreme Court stood firm. The sentence was upheld. Franklin would pay for his crime. Now, after nearly 3 decades on death row, the state of Ohio has set an execution date, which is February 11, 2026. Franklin's time is running out. Some criminal activities are so horrific that their impact is felt for generations, leaving wounds that never close, no matter how much time passes. This is one of those cases. It was January 21, 2005. A night of pure terror in the small town of Brimfield, Ohio. 3 innocent lives were stolen in a senseless act of violence. And the man responsible? James Earl Trimble. Trimble, a military veteran, had a history of domestic abuse. His relationship with Renee Bauer, his longtime girlfriend, had been falling apart. And on that cold January night, it reached a deadly breaking point. Trimble had snapped. He stormed into Renee's home, gun in hand, and opened fire. She never stood a chance. But the horror wasn't over. Trimble's killing spree was just beginning. After murdering Renee, Trimble fled. He needed a place to hide. And that's when he forced his way into a neighbor's home. Inside were 28-year-old Elsie Marcellus and her 7-year-old son, Dakota. Innocent, defenseless. Trimble showed no mercy. He executed Elsie, then turned his gun on Dakota. A mother and son, gone in an instant. Their only crime? Being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Trimble was now on the run, and Ohio was on high alert. Armed, dangerous, and willing to kill again. For hours he eluded capture, but there was nowhere left to hide. As law enforcement closed in, Trimble made a desperate move. He took a woman hostage. For hours, Trimble held the woman at gunpoint. Police knew they had to end this before more lives were lost. And finally, after a terrifying standoff, Trimble was taken into custody. Trimble showed no remorse as the charges were read. 3 counts of aggravated murder. Kidnapping. A jury had one choice. Death, a sentence for a man who showed no mercy to his victims. But like so many on death row, Trimble fought back. He filed appeal after appeal, hoping to escape his fate. Yet the Ohio Supreme Court stood firm. The sentence was upheld. Trimble would pay for his crimes. Now, after decades on death row, Ohio has set an execution date, which is now set for March 12, 2026, over 21 years after his crimes. The countdown to justice has begun. Some killers act in the heat of the moment, rage overtaking reason, leaving chaos in their wake. But others, the cold and calculating ones, commit their crimes with chilling precision. They plan, they manipulate, and they kill with purpose. Gerald Robert Hand was one of them. He didn't just kill once, he killed twice, and each time it was for one thing: money. Gerald Hand was a man who thought he could outsmart the system. His first wife's death was suspicious, yet he walked away a free man, with her life insurance money in his pocket. The authorities couldn't prove what they suspected, that Hand had orchestrated her death for financial gain. Years passed. He remarried, again and again. But in 2002, history repeated itself in a terrifyingly familiar way. Hand's fourth wife, Jill Hand, was murdered in what appeared to be a brutal home invasion. The crime scene was chaotic. Signs of a struggle, a shattered sense of security, and a grieving husband who claimed to be just another victim. But this time, detectives weren't so easily fooled. As investigators dug deeper, the cracks in Hand's story became undeniable. The so-called home invasion was anything but random. Evidence painted a far more sinister picture, one where Hand was not a grieving husband, but a cold-blooded mastermind. Detectives discovered that Hand had been hiring hitmen to eliminate his spouses. Each time, his goal was the same: collect the insurance payout and move on. His wives were nothing more than financial stepping stones, disposable pieces in his twisted game. Hand had fooled the system once, but he wouldn't fool it again. By 2003, the case against him was airtight. His web of lies had unraveled, and the jury saw through his act. The sentence was swift and final: death. For over 2 decades, Gerald Hand has sat on death row, waiting. He's watched the years slip by, filing appeal after appeal, hoping for another loophole, another escape. But justice, though slow, has not forgotten him. Now, 24 years after his conviction, the final chapter is about to be written. The state of Ohio has set Hand's execution for June 17, 2026. The delays are over. His final attempt to evade justice has failed. Cleveland Ramon Jackson thought he could escape justice. He was wrong. Some killers act in the heat of the moment. Others plan their crimes with chilling precision. And then there are those like Cleveland Ramon Jackson, ruthless, calculating, and utterly remorseless. It was January 2002 in Lima, Ohio. A home that should have been a place of safety became a scene of horror. Jackson and an accomplice stormed into an apartment, guns drawn, demanding money, drugs, and valuables. Inside were 8 people, including 3 children. What happened next was pure brutality. Jackson showed no mercy. He opened fire, striking 6 of the 8 occupants. Among the victims? 17-year-old Lenashia Williams and 3-year-old Jayla Grant. Neither survived. A teenager with her whole life ahead of her. A toddler who barely had a chance to live. Both executed in cold blood. Survivors played dead, praying for the nightmare to end. When Jackson finally fled, they were left in pools of their own blood, forever scarred by the violence they had just witnessed. But Jackson's attempt to escape justice was short-lived. He was caught, tried, and convicted of aggravated murder. The jury had no sympathy. They saw him for what he was, a killer with no remorse. Their verdict? Death. For more than 2 decades, Jackson has sat on death row, exhausting every possible appeal. But time has run out. The state of Ohio has set his execution date, July 15, 2026. The families of his victims have waited over 20 years for justice. And now, the end is near for Cleveland Ramon Jackson. Some killers strike in a moment of blind rage. Others plan their crimes with a chilling calculation. And then, there are those like James Derek O'Neill, who kill without remorse, leaving behind a trail of devastation. O'Neill was no stranger to violence. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a predator. And in 1993, his brutality reached horrifying new heights. It was a night that would change lives forever. In Columbus, Ohio, a city that had seen its fair share of crime, few were prepared for what was about to unfold. O'Neill, armed and merciless, set his sights on 60-year-old Inetta Howell, a woman who had done nothing to deserve the nightmare that awaited her. She was in her home, a place that should have been safe. But when O'Neill entered, safety became an illusion. He wasn't there to rob, to threaten, or to intimidate. He was there to kill. The attack was brutal. Howell was shot and left to die in her own home, the place she had built a life. And O'Neill? He vanished into the night, believing he could outrun justice. But the law was closing in. Witnesses, forensic evidence, and tireless detectives pieced together what had happened. O'Neill had left behind more than just chaos. He left a trail. And that trail led straight to him. His past spoke volumes, a history of violence, a disregard for human life, and a pattern that prosecutors wouldn't ignore. In 1994, James Derek O'Neill stood before a jury. The evidence was overwhelming. The crime was senseless. And the verdict? Guilty. The sentence? Death. But even behind bars, O'Neill wasn't done fighting. For decades, he appealed, challenged, and attempted to delay the inevitable. Legal battles stretched on, year after year. But in the end, there was no escaping justice. After more than 3 decades on death row, O'Neill's time is finally running out. Ohio has set his execution date. Soon the state will close the book on a case that has haunted the victims' families for far too long. James Derek O'Neill believed he could take a life and walk away. He believed he could outlast the system. But justice, though delayed, is never denied. And in 2026, Ohio will ensure that his reign of terror comes to an end. Some killers act in the heat of the moment. Others, like Gerald Hand, plan their crimes with chilling precision. Hand didn't just kill once. He killed twice. And each time, it was for one reason: money. Gerald Robert Hand was a man who believed he could commit the perfect crime, twice. He was a respected businessman, a family man. But behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. In 1976, tragedy struck when his first wife, Donna, was found dead under mysterious circumstances. Hand, the grieving husband, collected her life insurance payout. The case remained unsolved, and authorities couldn't prove his involvement, so he walked free. Years passed. Hand remarried. Then again. And again. 3 more wives. But one thing never changed: his greed. Fast forward to 2002. Hand's 4th wife, Jill Hand, was found murdered in their home. This time, the crime scene told a story. a staged home invasion meant to look like a robbery gone wrong. But detectives weren't fooled. The so-called burglars had left everything of value behind. No forced entry, no stolen jewelry, just a woman brutally murdered and a husband with everything to gain. The investigation dug deeper into Hand's past, uncovering a horrifying pattern. Hand wasn't just unlucky in marriage, he was eliminating his wives for financial gain. And this time, there was no escaping justice. Prosecutors presented their case, showing how Hand had been hiring hitmen to carry out his deadly scheme. His own greed and arrogance became his downfall. In 2003, the jury wasted no time. Hand was sentenced to death. For over 2 decades, he sat on death row, filing appeal after appeal, trying to delay the inevitable. But now, time is running out. After 24 years, Ohio has set an execution date, June 17, 2026. Gerald Robert Hand believed he could get away with murder. He believed he could outsmart the law. But in just months, the state of Ohio will ensure that his reign of terror comes to an end. Some crimes are so violent, so senseless, that they leave entire communities shaken. They instill fear. They rob families of their loved ones. They remind us of the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface. That was the case with Jerome Henderson, a convicted murderer who has spent decades fighting to escape his fate. But now, after 30 years on death row, his time is running out. It was May 1995. Elmore Brunson, a 58-year-old husband and father, was at home with his wife in Cleveland, Ohio. It was supposed to be a peaceful evening until the nightmare began. A shadow appeared in the doorway. A stranger, number A predator. Jerome Henderson forced his way inside, armed and dangerous. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was calculated. He wanted money. He wanted control. But when Elmore refused to comply, Henderson's true intentions became horrifyingly clear. The first shot rang out like a thunderclap. Then another, and another. Elmore Brunson was struck multiple times, his body crumbling to the floor. His wife, his partner in life, was left helpless, forced to watch the horror unfold, knowing she could be next. The killer didn't just take a man's life. He shattered a family. He stole a future. And then, he vanished into the night. But Henderson wasn't as smart as he thought. The Cleveland police tracked him down within hours. His past told the story of a violent man, a career criminal who had long been walking the line between freedom and a prison cell. This time, there would be no escape. In 1996, Jerome Henderson was convicted of murder, burglary, and armed robbery. The jury didn't need long to decide. He was sentenced to death. But as the years passed, Henderson refused to accept his fate. Appeal after appeal. Motion after motion. For 30 years, he fought to avoid execution, arguing for a second chance he never gave his victim. But the clock is ticking, and the state of Ohio has made its decision. The sentence will be carried out on October 21st, 2026. After 3 decades of delays, the family of Elmore Brunson will finally see justice served. Some crimes linger in the minds of a city for decades. Some cases seem to stretch on forever, with endless appeals, legal battles, and delays. But for Melvin D. Bunnell Jr., time has finally run out. After nearly 40 years of courtrooms, motions, and last-minute stays, the state of Ohio is ready to carry out his sentence. His execution date is set, marking the end of one of the longest-running death row cases in Ohio's history. It was a cold night in November 1986. In a quiet Cleveland apartment, 23-year-old Robert Bunner was enjoying a peaceful evening, completely unaware that his life was about to be stolen in a burst of violence. Suddenly, his front door crashed open. The intruder? Melvin Bunnell. And he didn't come to talk. Within seconds, gunfire rang out. 2 shots, point blank, straight to the chest. Bunner collapsed, blood soaking through his shirt as his life slipped away. The walls of his home, once a place of safety, became the backdrop to a senseless execution. Neighbors heard the gunshots. They called 911, but by the time police arrived, there was nothing they could do. Robert Bunner was dead. And Melvin Bunnell? He was already on the run. Bunnell thought he could escape, but the city of Cleveland was watching. Witnesses had seen him fleeing the scene, and the evidence against him piled up fast. The murder weapon? Recovered. The bullet casings? Matched to Bonnell's gun. And when they finally caught up with him, his clothes were still stained with blood. There was no question. Melvin Bonnell had pulled the trigger. The trial was swift. The jury didn't hesitate. By 1988, Bunnell was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But the story didn't end there. For nearly 4 decades, Bonnell fought his fate. Appeal after appeal, hearing after hearing, he used every legal loophole available to him. He challenged the evidence. He questioned the trial's fairness. His attorneys argued over forensic details, procedural errors, and his right to new DNA testing. Each time his execution neared, a new motion delayed it. Victims' families waited. Years turned into decades. But now, the waiting is over. Ohio has set Melvin Bunnell's final execution date for November 18, 2026. The delays are over. The legal battles are done. And after nearly 40 years, the book on this case is finally closing. Some crimes are so horrifying, so unimaginable, that they leave an entire community scarred forever. This is one of them. It was September 10, 1985. 12-year-old Raymond Fife left home on his bike, just like he had done so many times before. But this time, he never came back. When Raymond didn't return home for dinner, his family panicked. Hours passed. Then the search began. At 9 p.m., Raymond's father made a discovery that would haunt him forever. His son's body was found in an overgrown field, tortured beyond belief. Raymond had been beaten, strangled, sexually assaulted, and set on fire. His injuries were so severe that doctors couldn't believe he had survived even a few hours. For 2 days, Raymond fought for his life, but the brutality was too much. On September 12, he took his final breath. It didn't take long for police to zero in on their suspect, 18-year-old Danny Lee Hill. And what did he do next? It was as disturbing as the crime itself. Hill inserted himself into the investigation, acting like a concerned citizen. But something was off. He knew details about the crime that hadn't been made public. Under questioning, Hill's story kept changing. At one point, he even laughed while describing the attack. That was all the police needed. The jury wasted no time. Danny Lee Hill was sentenced to death. The judge called his crimes pure evil, a level of cruelty beyond comprehension. But justice would be delayed. Hill spent nearly 4 decades on death row, appealing his sentence again and again. His lawyers claimed he had intellectual disabilities and that he was unfit for execution. But in 2023, Ohio courts made a final ruling. Danny Lee Hill would be executed on July 22, 2026, and the state of Ohio is preparing to carry out his sentence. 9 names, 9 crimes, and a justice system that has determined their fate. But the debate over capital punishment continues. Should these men pay the ultimate price? Or is there another side to the story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.